This film is intended for eye surgeons for training and education purposes. Viewer discretion is strongly recommended.
Hi, this is Dr. Deepak Megur, and we have a very interesting case. It's a freak incident happening in a very complex case, and let's get started. He is an elderly male patient who has pseudoexfoliation, moderately dilating pupil, and an extremely dense cataract. The plan is to use pupil expansion device and then perform phacoemulsification, and the incisions are created, the capsule is stained, and OVD is placed into the anterior chamber. And time to place in the pupil expansion device. In this case, I'm using a different device than my usual one. This is the Gupta ring, which is somewhat similar to the Malugin ring. This is available in India, and it gives a slightly wider dilation compared to the BX ring. So I thought it would be ideal in such a dense cataract scenario. Point to note here before I start: in hindsight view is always 20/20, but when you're doing the surgery, you overlook certain things which are very obvious, like this thing. Please note that there's hardly any space between the iris and the capsule. It's extremely close. And I'm trying to maneuver this ring, and my first attempt, the scroll just slides over the iris rather than going under it and hooking it. So I'm trying to do it. I'm trying to maneuver it. At this time, I get an idea that maybe I have to twirl it around and then try to reinsert it. And during this process, because the chamber is quite shallow, the cannula of the cartridge has touched the anterior capsule and the anterior capsule is torn. So I just withdraw and come out and then put in OVD again and complete the rhexis now. If I had a second chance, what I would have done here was, since there is no space between the iris and the lens, I would have just injected a little bit of cohesive OVD under the iris, which would have lifted up the iris a little bit, creating some space. Then it would have been easier for me to maneuver, and I wouldn't have landed up with this complication of the capsule being torn. Nevertheless, the second time around, I will be smarter. I'm going to place the OVD under the iris. It's going to achieve two things. Because the iris is now at a different plane, it's easier for the scrolls to get themselves engaged onto the iris. The second advantage of lifting up the iris is we also want to prevent the scrolls of the ring getting entangled with the rhexis margin. That also is a concern. So using a cohesive OVD to lift up the iris would help that purpose. So ideally, when I inject, usually the three scrolls get engaged onto the pupil. But in this case, the scroll on my left hand side doesn't engage, whereas the scroll on my distant end and on the right hand side go in and engage the pupil in the first shot itself. But nevertheless, the remaining two slots have to be engaged into the pupil manually, which is done with relative ease. Now, before I start the surgery, I'd want to identify the rhexis margin. Now, it is not very well stained because originally the pupil was small. So what I do is I go back and inject a little bit of dye in the peripheral parts of the cataract, in the peripheral part, so that I can go and visualize the capsule. Now, because OVD is already there, which I have touched the anterior capsule, the staining would not be as good as when we do it in the beginning of the surgery. But nevertheless, I can still make out or delineate the rhexis margin. I confirm by using a Y hook that this is the rhexis margin. So it's going to give me a mental guide so that I don't want to stretch or break it. There's two reasons why I want to identify this rhexis margin. Number one is I want to ensure that the rhexis is not being engaged by the scrolls of the ring. Number two, it is not damaged during the insertion of the BX device. And number three would be, it also gives me a demarcation when trying to do lateral separation. I would be mindful that I would not be overstretching so that the rhexis would be torn. So these are the three reasons why I would want to identify or delineate the rhexis margin beforehand. Now, this is very dense cataract, and in such cases of late my technique has been the 4-quadrant technique. That's what I'm going to try and do it now. Now I begin the sculpting. So please note my left hand always supports the nucleus. So people who are learning phacoemulsification, I would recommend them to use the left hand to support the nucleus. Anyway, it's already into the eye. If you practice holding the nucleus with the second instrument when you're doing sculpting, the two advantages. Number one, if you learn this technique well enough, this would be helpful when we encounter a situation where the nucleus is mobile and you would want to sculpt. So supporting the nucleus just a little bit with the left hand always ensures that we'll be able to trench even a slightly mobile nucleus. Number two, by holding the nucleus stable by the second instrument, we're also not going to, put additional stress during sculpting. Many beginners would not be using the adequate power and would be rather mechanically pushing at the nucleus. So the stress which is transmitted to the bags is also minimized if you always support the lens with the second instrument. And this is a practice which I would encourage every phacosurgeon to practice. It's going to help us in many tricky situations. The nucleus is rotated 90 degrees and the sculpt is carried on. So as we keep on rotating the nucleus and sculpting, every new groove which we create will be significantly deeper than its previous groove. So these are extremely dense cataracts, and it's important to realize that going adequate depth is the single most critical factor which would help us to break the posterior plate using lesser mechanical force. And the whole problem is we are always not as deep enough as it deserves to be. So at this stage, I think I'm deep enough. Now I'm going to try the lateral separation maneuvers. And we should be mentally prepared that this is not going to crack in the first attempt itself. So you make a couple of attempts, and now I'm trying to change my technique. I'm going to hold one of the fragment with the phaco tip so that I can impart better traction with the left hand. The fragment is split, the nucleus is rotated, and the same technique of holding the nucleus with my phaco probe with high vacuum and placing the chopper progressively deeper to get a crack which is extending right up to the center point. So now I think we have got one free fragment. The fragment which is free is engaged by the phaco tip and then pulled out of the bag in the central safe zone. And since it's relatively huge, I try to attempt to break it down into two fragments and then consume in a very controlled manner. Please note that I'm going very slow and the plane of emulsification is at the level of the pupillary margin, and the fragments are moving around in a place which is much posterior. Another important point we need to realize that, as we can see, the followability of the fragments is not very great. The simple reason is the two fragments are not totally separated from each other. That's the only reason why the attraction towards the tip is mitigated. We need to understand the most common reason for poor followability is that when the fragments are not totally separate from each other. So that's the situation where the fragments will not be very freely attracted towards the phaco tip. So that one concept one has to understand. Eventually the fragments are emulsified successfully. The chamber is filled with OVD, and at this time I realized that the remaining fragment are not totally separated from each other. So the bag is refilled with OVD, and using two long Sinskey hooks, I am mechanically trying to separate them. So one fragment could be separated from this large heminucleus. The second fragment I'm unable to do so. I'll just keep it there as it is. So I'm not going to struggle to separate it using the Sinskey hook. I'm just going to refill the chamber with OVD. I go in with my phaco probe and then the long Sinskey hook. I engage one of the fragment with the phaco tip and then do the chopping and the lateral separation maneuvers. So one of the fragments is held with the tip and then flipped out of the bag and then emulsified. Again, the chamber is refilled with OVD. First the dispersive OVD goes in, followed by HPMC underneath it, and the last fragment needs to be emulsified. So at this stage, we can see few calcific spots in the posterior capsule. That is to be expected. The anterior capsule also had these capsular plaques. And thankfully, the zonules have been very healthy in spite of the long-standing nature of the cataract and also pseudoexfoliation. The one thing which was good about this case was the zonules were reasonably good. The last fragments are then being emulsified in a very controlled manner. So that's it. There's hardly any cortex to remove, but I'm just trying to irrigate with PSS just to loosen out any of the loose cortical fibers. The capsular bag is filled with OVD. The planned multi-piece hydrophobic lens is being placed into the capsular bag. I just want to change onto the retroillumination mode just to see that the lens is truly inside the bag. Time to remove the pupil expansion device. This is the Gupta ring. So using a Sinskuk, you disengage all the scrolls manually. Now because this is a biplanar ring, removing it can be tricky. So what I do is, there's one small trick while removing this. So I use a iris repositor and push the posterior lip of the main incision down so that the bulky scroll doesn't get caught in the incision. So by pressing it down, you create more space, and then the forceps just negotiates the device out of the antechamber. The time to remove the OVD both in front and behind the lens is irrigated out. The side ports are hydrated. That's it, the case is done. These are the first day post-op pictures. So that was it. Thank you for watching and hope you found this helpful.